I'm Tommaso Poggio. I'm the director of the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, and I'm happy to present to you this panel discussion about what seems to be and should be a hot topic in science and technology today. So, these are the rules of the evening, the rules of engagement tonight. I'll first give the background of the panel, why we're doing this. I'll then ask some questions that we hope the panel will address. And then before starting the discussion, I'll introduce each of the panelists. Patrick will speak first for 5 minutes, will be the first one, and then each one of the others will follow. And then after this set of 5 minutes talks, which will take roughly half an hour, we'll start a real discussion among the panelists. And we plan to have roughly an hour of discussion or so, depending how it goes. I'll cut it early if it gets ugly. All right, so the background is that the center mission is to work understanding and replicating intelligence, understanding the capabilities of the human brains, understanding how the brain generates the mind. And the plan is to do that let me see. Sorry. We plan to do that through a research program which is based on the realization that the last 5 years or so have been a magic time for the history of the science of intelligence. We are starting to have systems that are as intelligent as we are, or better, in different narrow domains of intelligence. Is chess playing, is Jeopardy, it's driving a car with vision. But none of these systems is intelligent in the sense that you can ask the system to ask questions about a scene like this, ask question about what is there, who is there, what are they speaking about making a little story out of what's happening there. And so our goal, our plan is to make progress in the basic science of how we can do this task, how we can answer this question, how our brain can answer this question. And we plan to do this by measuring our progress against a set of, you can call it super Turing tests. Super Turing because it's Turing tests about vision, answering questions about images and videos, simple questions like what is there, who is there, more complex questions like what is going to happen in this scene, what is this girl thinking about this boy, and all questions that any one of us can answer or try to answer. And I don't think we don't have any idea of how to build machines that can do that, despite the progress in the last few years and the progress that will undoubtedly happen within companies like Google in the next 5 years. And we want answers to these questions that are not only at the level of human performance, but also the level of what neurons in the brain are doing. So that's a more difficult question than a standard Turing test of vision. Now, motivated by this, must say, Apple is not Microsoft, but still does not work. Now these are questions for the panels, not the only ones, but some, so, panelists should look at them. It's questions about if we want to understand intelligence, replicate it in machines, is the road to understand first the brain and human intelligence, or can this be done on a different path without worrying about neuroscience and cognitive science? And there are some specific questions that we can ask since we have Geoff Hinton there. Can we just develop more complex neural networks, replacing sigmoids with more complex functions and maybe capsules and get these systems at some point suddenly to become intelligent? This is what, this is what Elon Musk and Steve Hawkins are worrying about. But of course, things like this have been predicted forever, that in 15 years we'll have intelligent machines. This prediction has been made since 100 years or so, and is still 15 years away. So, and more generally, what do we need to do in order to understand intelligence? In particular, a question that it's important for me is, does understand intelligence meaning we have to have a theory of it? Or just some hackers getting, some systems, say deep learning networks to work very well, without any understanding of what's going on. Okay. So let me go. Let me introduce now. No, wait. Nobody gets up.
I was trying to cut you off because I already stopped.
So I'll introduce each panelist in order of appearance. I'll be brief because I expect most of you to know our panelists. They are MIT people. So Patrick Winston is Ford Professor of Artificial Intelligence and Computer Science at MIT. He joined the faculty in 1970. Wow. And is a member, of course, of the CSAIL, the Computer Science Artificial Intelligence Lab. He served as director of the Artificial Intelligence Lab for 72 to 97, and he started to serve as a director well before finishing his PhD thesis on machine learning. Served on many MIT committees, taught many courses, has a great talk everybody should go listen to during IAP on how to speak. And he studies how vision, language, and motor faculties account for intelligence. 17 books. He's a member of CBMM's management. And among many other honors, he received the Meritorious Public Service Award. All right, so Josh Tenenbaum is a professor at MIT in our department, Brain and Cognitive Science, also a member of the CSAIL. Received his PhD in 99. He was at Stanford from 99 to 2002. He studies learning and inference in human and machines with the twin goal of understanding human intelligence and bringing computers closer to human capabilities. He's teaching a very good and very popular course in machine learning and cognition, and is a member of CBMM and his management team. He's a recipient of Menure Investigator Award from the Society of Mathematical Psychology, Distinguished Scientific Award for Early Career Contribution, and so on and so on. Laura Schulz is a professor in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science. Her lab studies babies and children and how the infrastructure of human cognition is constructed during early childhood, how it develops. She's a member of CBMM, and among her honors, she was MIT MacVicar Fellow and the recipient of the Troland Award of the National Academy of Science in 2012. Bob De Simone is my boss. He's the director of the McGovern Institute. And he's the Doris and Don Berkeley Professor in our department, Brain and Cognitive Science. Before joining McGovern, he was director of the Intramural Research Program at NIH. He studies the brain mechanisms that allow us to focus our attention on a specific task. He's the person actually who found the first physiological mechanism underlying attention, visual attention, and he has shown that relevant information is selectively amplified in certain brain regions. He's a member of CBMM, he's a member of the National Academy of Science, the American Academy of Arts and Science, recipient of numerous awards, including the Troland Prize of the National Academy of Science. Shimon Ullman is the Sami and Ruth Kohn Professor of Computer Science at the Weizmann Institute. Is an adjunct professor at MIT. He's received his PhD at MIT in electrical engineering and computer science in 1977. He was the first graduate student of David Marr. And then he went from MIT to the Weizmann to study visual processing in humans and machines, and he has made a number of very key insights in his field. He's a member of CBMM. He was awarded the 2008 Rummerat Prize for Theoretical Contribution in Cognitive Science. He's also a co-founder of Orbotech, one of the first high-tech companies in Israel, and a member of the Israel Council for Higher Education. And Geoffrey Hinton, I will not say much because he's well known, even if he's not at MIT. And he has been introduced at least twice over the last 24 hours. So I think I met him the first time in San Diego. This has been 1979 or 8, with Norman and David Marr. He has been a charismatic figure in the field of machine learning since the 70s. 2 years ago, his postdocs did very well on this computer vision benchmark, ImageNet. And so Geoffrey agreed to be acquired by Google. And by doing that, he started an epidemic that over the last 24 months has seen a lot of machine learning researches falling to Google, Facebook, Baidu, Alibaba, Microsoft, even IBM being bought or hired left and right by them. So he was a professor in the computer science department, University of Toronto, where he's now an emeritus university professor, and he's also a distinguished researcher at Google. Among many of his honors, he's an honorary foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Science, a fellow of the Royal Society, was awarded the Rummerat Prize, and is not a member of CBMM. But if survives this panel, maybe we'll make you an honorary member of it. Okay, so now, Patrick, you can come here, and after you speak for 5 minutes, no more, you can sit there.
Well, I think it's a great privilege to be on the panel, partly because it guarantees a seat. Beyond that, I'm also pleased to be the first speaker because noting the other speakers, it's the only real way I could be confident having an opportunity to say anything. But not for a second, some of you who know us both understand that. Now, these are interesting times, at least for me, because when I started off in artificial intelligence, they were well-meaning, but when I started in artificial intelligence, there were well-meaning but foolish people, like Hubert Dreyfus, who said that the enterprise was impossible. And now we have well-meaning and perhaps foolish people who say it's not only possible, it's dangerous. And I think that's a wild exaggeration. On my list, it's only fourth or fifth, well behind things like, engineered pandemics, nuclear war, environmental collapse, and things of that sort. But before I go any further, I've been commanded to speak for 5 minutes at most, so I better get to the bottom line. And my bottom line is that artificial intelligence, where does it go? It goes through the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines. And that's because what the enterprise is focused on is getting a large community of people with different skills and talents to combine together to produce implementable models of what goes on in here. So it's not just models of what goes on in here, and it's not just implemented systems that do stuff, but it's implementable models of what goes on in here. So when I think about what's happening now, especially during the past couple of days, listening to Jeff's extraordinarily exciting talk, is how to think about all the sorts of stuff that's being done. And I tend to think about these sorts of things from the perspective of what a model is. I think what MIT is all about is MIT is about models. We build models of everything here. We build models with differential equations. We build models with stories. We build models in every kind of thing that we engage in. And what's a model? It's a mechanism. It's a surrogate for something that helps us to understand it. That helps us to make predictions, that helps us to understand the past, that helps us to control situations and to build stuff. And from my perspective, incidentally, we don't really understand how something works unless we can build it. So that's one reason why I think that the CBM enterprise has to have challenge problems of the sort that Tommaso has talked about, aimed at building systems that can do the kinds of things that go on in here, but in ways that are consistent with and faithful to what we know about what goes on in there. So to be more specific about how I think I will be thinking about the sorts of things that have been happening in recent months, I have to go back and focus on what kinds of ways a model can be impressive. And one way a model can be impressive, of course, if it's an engineering success. And without a doubt, the announcements made by Stanford and Google in the past couple of weeks have been amazing engineering successes. It's hard to imagine how they could be more impressive. Another way, however, that a model can be impressive is if it illuminates something about the problem itself. And in some respects, the Google and Stanford announcements have been more interesting to me in the things that they don't do quite right than in the things that they do right, because the things that they get wrong are, to me, saying something about the nature of the problem. Next way in which a model can be interesting is if it's behaviorally faithful. If it does the same thing that a biological system does with the same kind of information that a biological system has. And in this, I think I would be, what I would like to see would be equipping a small child with a little camera pasted on its head so we could take 10 million pictures of what it sees in the first year of life, or maybe 18 months, and then see if those pictures could be used by a deep learning type of system to name the kinds of things that deep learning systems can name. I suppose some tenure-hungry professor might do that, but probably be arrested in the effort. But biological faithfulness is not necessarily interesting because it can be biologically faithful in the same sense that Eliza was biologically faithful. It might act like the Rogerian psychiatrist, but not impress us very much when we see what it does on the inside. So the next dimension in which I think a model can be interesting is if it is what I like to think of is constraint congruent. That is to say, it does what it does because it uses the same kind of information that a biological system would be using to achieve its biological faithful behavior. It's easier to explain what I mean by that by citing the well-known example of something that performed well, but not in a way that was constraint congruent with what we people do. It was that famous incident in which a perceptron system was trained to recognize tanks and performed beautifully well. But I think it was Seymour Papert who noted that all of the pictures of the tanks were taken in the morning when it was rather dark and overcast, and all of the pictures without the tanks were taken in the afternoon when it was bright and sunny. So although it was performing extraordinarily well, it was basically an illumination detector and not using the same kind of constraints that people were using when they did the same job. Well, just two more. Going beyond being constraint congruent, I like to think in terms of being algorithmically aligned. And by that I mean a system is interesting to me if it is plausibly doing the same kind of algorithmic work that goes on in my head. So a system might do that because it's doing a template match. It might do that because it's doing capsules. It might do that because it's doing a variety of kinds of things, combining the effects of many classifiers. If it's doing things at that algorithmic level that are aligned with what I think might be happening in here, then I think it is an interesting model. And finally, of course, there's the substance of what we're talking about now, which is a model is interesting if it is neurally plausible. So the thing I find exciting about the past couple of days is that we're engaging with a neurologically plausible world with a kind of attention to structure that I think is essential to getting it up to the level that I'm personally interested in, which has to do with the ways in which we humans are different from other species. And in that, I think the key difference is that we humans understand stories and can tell them and can recombine them to make new stories, creative stories, and do the kinds of things that the Neanderthals couldn't. So when I think about what's happened in the past couple of days, whenever Jeff talks, I think about it for a year. What I'll be thinking about in the next year is how the kinds of things that Jeff has talked about can be brought together with the kinds of things I think about, which are sequences and actions and assemblies of events. And make ourselves creative. So that concludes what I would like to say about this. I think it's an extraordinarily exciting time to be here, and I look forward to all that we're going to be able to do in the center in the next decade.
Thank you, Patrick. Josh.
Tommy said no slides, so I wrote them. So it's a great privilege and honor and really exciting to be here, and it's nice to bring Jeff in and have such an audience for all of us here and what the center is trying to accomplish. It's remarkable and impressive and inspiring, the kind of developments that Jeff talked about, particularly the ones yesterday, in terms of how, what in some ways are old and simple ideas made much more powerful with new technology on the data side, on the computer science side, how much the progress in deep learning has revolutionized certain problems of vision and other kinds of pattern recognition problems, how much attention industry and government is paying to that, how much attention is getting to AI, and to the connections between AI and the brain and science. So that's super exciting. And somehow my notes got wiped out. How did that happen? I would say also, like many in the center, and I think like Jeff, I think that there are many ways into big problems of intelligence, but something like problems of scene understanding and hard, challenging problems of scene understanding, that's a good way in, I think. I would say that, and again, like Jeff, very much like in sort of today's talk, as opposed to yesterday's talk, that's going to mean going beyond some of the kinds of problems and approaches that the current sort of very heavily data-driven approaches in machine vision are taking, and to tackle problems in scene understanding that are fundamentally more challenging in ways that brains, and maybe even distinctively human brains and minds, are particularly good at. So for me, that means problems, and these are problems very much like ones that Tommy talked about that our center is interested in. It means starting off actually with problems of object recognition that are much more challenging in terms of the kinds of invariance, pose invariance, dealing with occlusion, very sparse data, compared to the sorts of things that we're currently seeing in data-heavy machine vision. So for example, this isn't something that Jeff talked about, but relatedly, deep face, right? It's a nice example of applying deep learning to face recognition, and it can get 97% correct human-level performance on certain class of faces, which are basically the faces that people think are worth uploading and labeling with people's names onto the web and Facebook and stuff. So that means basically nice, fully visible frontal views with maybe slight, small, maybe 30-degree pose radius. But look around at all the faces in this room, people you know and recognize. Or if you go back to the image that Tommy showed, since I'm not allowed to show slides, I'll refer to his slide, the one with Joel and others in there. Only one of those faces, I think, would even be an acceptable input to the deep face system. And all the other ones are some heavy profile view, which, if you know the people, I know Joel, I don't know the other people there, you have no trouble recognizing even somebody, think of all the times when you've seen somebody where you just see them walking down the hall from the back, or from, someone up on the stairs, and you just glimpse, like, maybe a particular shadow of their chin is enough, right? So we've been interested in all those kinds of problems of hard recognition. Right? Our ability to understand scenes doesn't just include those kind of problems, but as some of you might know, if you've seen talks I've given here recently, for example, to understand the intuitive physics of a scene, or even the intuitive psychology of a scene. So again, without slides, I'll just take the scene in front of me. So here's this table, right? We know that not only are there some bottles and cups and other funny objects, dongles and such, which I don't even know the name for, that'll come in a second. So we know there are all these things here, right? But we also understand that they're all stably supported by the table. Although you saw when it rocked a little bit like this, you might get a little bit nervous. If I put these things over here, you might get a little bit more nervous, right? If you can see it. Because you understand intuitively a rich analysis of the forces that are involved here. The masses, the role of gravity, the role of the perturbations here, what role friction is playing keeping these things here. You know that if I put this thing on its side, it's going to get a little bit maybe more, there we go, a little more precarious. And so on. You know what would happen if I were to remove the table? These things would fall. You know that just going like this and sort of sticking this on the side isn't going to make it stick there. If I let go of it, it's going to fall. But you can catch it by doing that sort of thing. So if you want to talk about things like Turing tests, there's a literally endless number of things you can ask about, comment about, just in the physics of a bunch of objects on a scene like this. The same kind of thing extends to people's goals, but I won't really talk about that. And referring to things like these funny things, also a theme in common with Jeff's talk, the idea of one-shot learning, right? You want to think about the hard problems of learning, whether it's object concepts or physical concepts or other things. Even very young children are able to learn new things, like, think about the first time you learned what a dongle was. I've only recently converted to Macs, but at some point we all got used to the fact that we couldn't just directly plug our cable into this. We had to carry around these other funny things. And one dongle is enough to know that this is a dongle too. I think this is a dongle. This is a dongle. This is a dongle. They're all sort of different dongles. This is maybe like a dongle without a cord, but that's not really a dongle. It's like an adapter or something, right? So, but that ability to generalize from one instance of a new concept to another one, integrating both some of the shape and the function, that's a very sophisticated kind of problem, which can just happen in an individual scene. So those are problems we want to work on. Also, like Jeff, and in the spirit of today's talk, really, I think that the kind of intelligence that underlies our ability to do all those things is a kind of analysis by synthesis. Again, if you've heard me talk recently, it's also a kind of inverse graphics that we've been pursuing in our group recently. I think where the only place is really where I start to differ in my approach to intelligence, and it's really, I think it's really quite close to Jeff in a lot of ways, is I want to take inverse graphics literally, even more literally than I think Jeff wants to take, or at least that's the one. If there's the only thing we're going to spar about, who's taking inverse graphics more literally. For us, what we've been doing is actually taking graphics engines and saying, positing and exploring the idea in computational models that can be tested behaviorally and also even, hopefully, ultimately, neurally. The idea that your brain has in it an actual graphics engine, something like the kind of ones that are used in computer graphics, not just post-transformations, but all the rest of it too. Tools for modeling objects, something like CAD tools, so things which are now part of most kinds of computer graphics engines, particularly the ones that are used in real-time video games, like physics engines. So, these days, graphics and physical modeling almost go together. It's a toolkit of modeling approaches which you're familiar with in Pixar movies or in real-time, various kinds of real-time shooting games, touch physics games, which many of us play on our phones, right? We think that your brain has that kind of game engine there, and it extends also to intuitive psychology, your ability to analyze other people's the behaviors of other agents in terms of their mental states, their beliefs and desires, is a kind of inverse planning, the same way that your ability to analyze the physical scene is a kind of inverse graphics and physics engine business. If you think of agents as being guided by some kind of planning model, the sort of thing that people in robotics have developed, then you can kind of do a Bayesian inversion of that too. So that's, in a sense, that's my view of inverse graphics. I think when you the hard challenges to me then were also relating to Jeff's perspective is to say, well, how might this work in the brain? Honestly, I have really no idea how to implement a physics engine or a graphics engine in neurons. Where I differ from Jeff or I don't know if this is differing or not, but actually the talk we saw today was, to me, very inspiringly, much more psychologically and cognitively inspired, right? I thought it was beautiful that the whole first half of the talk was psychology, and there was very little neuroscience, which is not that I don't mean, which is nothing against neuroscience, nothing against Tommy's boss or anything, but again, in the spirit of the MAR approach, I just think that there is, particularly if we're trying to understand human intelligence, we just actually understand it. We understand the relevant constraints at this point much better coming from the psychology and the cognitive side. But then the goal for me of participating in the center of this whole project is very much to work down in the MAR sort of tradition to the neural constraints. And here again, I think I'm mostly in agreement with Jeff that psychology, for the hard problems of scene understanding, not the things that the deep learning, just data-driven deep learning from yesterday's talk is doing, but for this kind of stuff, psychology is really the data source of constraint. And so I don't worry so much, to start off with, about how physics engines and graphics engines can be implemented in neural circuits if I understand how they can be implemented in software, like the kind of software in here. Okay, the other place where we might differ, and again, here maybe because both before CVMM and even more so since, where I've spent a lot of time talking with Liz Felke over here and getting those nativist hooks into my brain even more deeply than Jeff. It's not so easy for me to see how a physics engine or a graphics engine could be learned by gradient descent or stochastic gradient descent or anything like the kinds of sort of good engineering, reliable learning algorithms that you can run in an hour on a MacBook or even 2 days in MATLAB. We don't know how to build a backprop that's going to learn a physics engine. Maybe Jeff will show us how, and that would be wonderful. But here I'm not so worried because, again, as Liz and I think many others have shown us over the last couple of decades, evolution, I believe, has built a lot of relevant stuff into our brain. Maybe just a few more steps beyond where Jeff currently is there in terms of what might have actually been built in innately. I think, but in the grand scheme of things, I think we're pretty much coming from the same perspective. And it'll be exciting both within CVMM and also with our fellow travelers. I think Google, not just Jeff, but Google, when Tommy was describing CVMM and said, when Patrick was saying, bringing together all these people from different perspectives to try to reverse engineer what's in the brain, I'm really excited what Google and DeepMind are doing. So I think they are another instance of doing that sort of thing. And I think in the long run, what we're doing is going to look a lot more like what each other is trying to do than actually what a lot of other approaches are out there. So I'll turn it over to Arabic.
It's a real privilege to be here and to be on this panel. And I think that the main thing I'm going to say, and the main thing I'm sort of qualified to speak about, is actually this moniker itself, this idea of deep learning. Because deep learning holds out a kind of promissory note that a more innocuous name, like, say, backpropagation, doesn't hold out. And in particular, it implies, at least evocatively, two different kinds of promises. One, that deep learning can tell us deep things about learning, that we can use these models to understand specific and precise things about human behavior. And of course, the other promise is that these models will be capable of implementing learning about deep things, the kind of learning that we think is distinctive and important to human intelligence. And so I want to take up the implied promises. And of course, it's not committed to that. They could just refer to deep layers of networks. But if you're going to use a title like this, then you're going to evoke these concepts. And my question, I guess, is how much we should look to deep learning to make good on these kinds of promises. So thinking about the first idea first, I really am genuinely curious. How can we use these models? What can we learn about learning in these ingeniously designed networks with lots of hidden layers that we're working on large data sets that can make predictions about human behavior? How can I be informed by these models as a cognitive scientist, as a researcher, and their successes and failures to design experiments or to make particular predictions? Is that the kind of promise that's held out by these models? Or are they, in some sense, incredibly sophisticated but largely black boxes that are going to be able to do a lot of things that we want them to do, and that can maybe echo or even exceed human performance, but may or may not give rise to the kinds of experiments or interventions or predictions that tell us something more about what it's like for human beings to reason about the world. So that's one question I have. The kind of question I think about more often is how much these systems are capable of actually deep learning. And that isn't to take anything against the exciting successes in things like image processing and speech recognition and natural language processing, because these are clearly phenomenal successes. So at the risk of being terribly reductive about phenomenal technological successes, it's still tempting to think that what these systems are doing is what they are designed to do, which is match input to desired output. And that is a huge kind of accomplishment. But human learners, even our very youngest human learners, do much more than make matches. They're much more than classifiers and parsers of the world. And I think that the kind of problem here is not just the problem that children can maybe learn in many fewer trials with much sparser data or do one-shot learning, although I think that is true. But clearly these kinds of approaches are getting much closer there. I don't think actually human children can probably learn their numerals on 25 labeled examples. I think they're probably worse at that in some ways than these machines. So I think that maybe that kind of problem, we might be getting close. I know. It's hard to win. But I think that's the only problem, even, right? And I don't think the problem is just also the places I agree with Josh, with Liz. There is, good evidence to suggest that humans and other animals probably have a lot more innate constraints that they come into the world with that encode abstract features of objects and forces or agents and goals. Although, again, I think that's true. I also don't think the problem is that human learners probably do something more and different, at least in many cases, than stochastic gradient descent over large data sets. I think there's pretty good evidence that human learners, even young children, can entertain, maybe one or two hypotheses and actively search for evidence to distinguish them and disambiguate them and engage in processes of discovery that are not maybe well captured by systems like gradient descent. But I think that the real problem is if you really want to take seriously what's deep about human learning, then it's our ability to go beyond the data and go beyond the data, even with really elegant ways of filtering and analyzing and synthesizing that data. What's deep about human learning is not just that we can represent a scene like a group of blocks and patch some difficulties with high order parity, mentally rotate those blocks or visualize it in different ways. It's really the fact that we can look at a bunch of blocks and see things that aren't there. We can see the future or the past or counterfactuals. We can see bridges and castles and graveyards and riots in a bunch of bricks. And those problems are ill-posed, right? The problems of invariance, the problems of equivariance are much better posed kinds of problems. And the problems I'm gesturing at are really a problem of how human beings generate massive variance, how it is that we generate altogether new hypotheses, how we look at scenes and make up new things to see, new things to learn, new things to do with those kinds of scenes. And there's a certain sense in which those abilities are trivial in the sense that any child can do it. But I don't think it's necessarily true that any other animal can do it. And I'm not sure that any deep network can do it. I'm not sure it's a problem of more layers or more data or faster problem or faster processing. I think it might be a different kind of problem. So one of my questions is how far these deep networks can go in getting at the kinds of things that are really deep and uniquely human about human learning, and that help us understand really the problem of thinking.
Thank you.
You'll get the neuroscience now, and Shimon, you can give the rebuttal. So Tommy asked me to comment on this, the idea of whether we will have more intelligent machines in the future by paying attention to neuroscientists, and I got stuck right away on this idea of what's an intelligent machine. I was thinking of imagining, like, someday in the future, a salesman from a company that's owned by Google or Alibaba or something goes to Toyota and says, I have a really intelligent machine for building your cars. It passed all of Tommy Poggio's Turing tests. You really want this machine in your factory? And so they put this machine in there, and it seems it's working great. But the next day, it's doing nothing. And so the owner is upset. And the salesman will say, well, yeah, the machine says it's not going to work. It's bored. It's wondering what is its purpose in life, doing this repetitive things all day. And it was programmed in mainland China. It doesn't really trust these Japanese managers, and it's and so you'd say, well, yeah. So really, what we don't want intelligent machines in the sense that they emulate human intelligence, which is irrational, self-destructive, prejudiced. What we want is our idea of an intelligent machine is to implement some idealized form of some very narrow aspect of what we do, so it'll be helpful to us in some way. So we want our machines to be like idiot savants, really good at in some restricted domain, and then if you think about what those domains are, they're Tommy's example of the scene, where people around having drinks and eating and so on, and so yeah, it'd be useful to have machines that understood what was going on in a scene like that, and that I can relate to more as a neuroscientist, also studying the visual system. And I was thinking, so what does a neuroscientist have to offer about the neural mechanisms involved in something like that? And I was sort of thinking about back to the days when I was a graduate student doing neurophysiology in monkeys in Charlie Gross's lab. And this is the days before people all collected all their data with computers, and they don't really understand what's going on in the experiment anyhow until MATLAB tells them what happened. But back in those days, you actually listened to neurons, over loudspeakers, and you actually waved your hands and put your face out in front of monkeys and so on, and listen what the neurons did. And the thing that the overwhelming memory that I have from that time was that the neurons that you recorded from a lot of these higher order areas, each one of them seemed like they were really intelligent. So if you record it from a neuron that was a face neuron, you like play peekaboo with the neuron. You would go there, and the neuron go blap blap blap, or you draw something on a piece of paper, and it would look, it's like, well, is this a person? I don't know. Show it to the neuron, and then you show it to the neuron, and the neuron go, I say, oh yeah, that's a good face, and then even if it wasn't like completely invariant, I was thinking again of like the hierarchy is like there's an area where the face you had to be in profile, right? And so you say, well, is this a profile? Is that what if you did this? Is that a profile? Or is it? And you could do those things, and the neuron would tell you what it thought about your attempt to create that kind of stimulus. So what's the point of this rambling about the past? But the point was that I was resonating to Jeff's ideas about the hierarchy, which at every stage of the hierarchy there are certain forms of invariances, and what seems to be the case in the biological visual system is we also have this hierarchy with limited domains of intelligence at multiple levels of the hierarchy, and the key thing is that all of the outputs at all the levels of the hierarchy are made available to the rest of the brain. I mean, normally when we think about the hierarchy, we think about, there's this process, and it'll go up to the top. And I was thinking about you want a label, like the label is, oh, I'm looking at Tommy. But really what you have access to the information about Tommy's pose, and how's Tommy moving, and so on and so on. And those are being extracted at all the various levels of the biological hierarchy and made available simultaneously with things like the categorical labels and so on. And I think that that our understanding of each of those levels of the hierarchy, I think, is clearly advancing in biological vision. I can't help but imagine that it's going to be useful in creating our intelligent scene recognition systems, which will be kind of like our idiot savant and intelligent machines. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to make a few comments on the road to intelligence, using again the vision as the domain example. But I think that the issues are quite general and are not limited specifically to vision. But I think that in vision, probably more than in other areas, as we noted already here, there has been really quite a remarkable success in recent years, accomplishing things that were almost unimagined a few years before that, relying heavily on advances in theoretical machine learning and on some clever, useful, practical algorithms. But I think that these successes rely, even in relatively simple tasks, on very extensive training by a large number of very often richly annotated examples that you have to spoon feed the system in order to succeed. In ImageNet, for example, which is it's a database of something like 15,000 visual categories, I think, with a few thousand images per category. So there are millions and millions of images, and typically in visual computer vision systems, they are getting trained on about half of the image in this data set, and then they are trained on the other half. And this is just for producing the label, the name of the object. If you want something more sophisticated, still pretty decent and humble, you want to also delineate where the object is, then you have to train your systems on many, many other examples in which people carefully annotated example objects, and then they learn from this, and then they can do these other tasks. And if you want more sophisticated things, then when you go and you try to extract more richer information, then things continue along this way, and you need more examples, and you need them to be carefully, richly annotated in order to get the right information out. So single object recognition, in which we had remarkable success, is relatively simple task compared to more natural tasks that people can do. People can look at images, and as we discussed, they can get very rich and deep information about people and about actions and about goals and about agents out in the world and the way they interact. And they can do all of these things very quickly. They learn these things quickly and typically without supervision and without annotation. So it's not just the technical problem of who supplies the data, but there is a trend there that shows us in something important, and it's worrisome that the more you want, and the deeper the information, more structured, you need to supply more and more data and to prepare it and annotate the important things that the machine should or the system should pay attention to. In our own work, we've been interested for these reasons in examples in which for machines they will require a lot of annotated data and help, and that on the other hand that children, even infants, can get very quickly and can get it without any help and without any supervision and any annotation. Let me give you, I will not go of course into any detail, but just sort of in telegraphic way, just to tell you about 2 or 3 concrete examples, just to as examples of what I mean, and try to make the general conclusion from this. So one example for that infants do very quickly early on, and it's surprisingly for computer vision type of research, is recognizing hand, just being able to recognize the object hand, because it's so flexible and there are so many different views that a hand can take, that has been considered in computer vision a particularly difficult problem in object recognition, and it's typically approached by richly supervised and long training of systems in order to accomplish this task. And yet for infants, it's sort of the second most obvious object to pay attention to. They start maybe with faces, and the second thing that they look a lot of is hands, and they know what they are, and they can recognize them when are small, in dynamic, static images. They do it very well without any supervision in the very early stages of their lives. So this is surprising. And we think, and I will not go into all the details, that we have some special mechanism in our visual system that sort of direct us to pay attention to hands, to pick up specifically images of hands, despite the fact that they are so variable. And the suggestion is based basically on the suggestion, based on some computational experiments and some available evidence from infant data, is that hands are special, they have special sort of dynamic characteristic. They are moving objects that also typically can cause other objects to move. And it has been known that infants or human beings have in their visual systems from birth, they have sort of special capabilities, special detectors tuned to this kind of dynamic pattern of activity of regions in the image that are moving, and they can come in contact with other regions and carry them around or cause them to move. And we think that you have specialized detectors for these things. They can detect them, they can use them in order to extract specifically hands, learn about hands, and about the properties of hands as active agents that can move things around and so on. And then hands give rise to other things like direction of gaze, which I want to sort of mention because if you think about it, it's surprising. Infants can very quickly, within the first 3 months of their lives, start to pay attention to direction of gaze, where what objects other people are looking at. And this is something that is interesting because it's not salient, not obvious. It doesn't exist, in fact, in the image. And somehow they pick it up and they learn it and they can compute it. And we think, again, that this is directed by specialized mechanism and that infants actually pay attention to hands. It's sort of come related to hands. And when hands initially grab an object, they make an initial contact to grasp it and to move it around, then they typically, in fact, we measured it, it's over 90% of the time, they are looking directly at the object that they are making contact with. And we think that our mechanisms are, again, sensitive to these particular events, and they watch for hands coming in contact with objects. And then when they do it, the next thing they do is to look at the face, and they use it as a particular example in which the direction of gaze is known. It's from the eyes to the point of contact, and they used it in order to master the concept of direction of looking, and they use it in order to be able to deal with this particular problem. Gaze is, by the way, even used later on for other things. We use it later, infants use it later on to know what people are attending to, and this is used later on in other things like language acquisition. It turns out that disambiguate nouns, this turns out to be a useful cue that people use. If it's a new noun that you don't know what it refers to, then it's more likely to refer to the object that the speaker is now looking at. So it's also interesting to see this, not just the isolated cues and mechanisms, but the sort of natural developmental trajectories that moving regions can lead to hands, and hands to gaze, and gaze to reference of nouns. And if you build the system correctly, all of these things will sort of unfold. And very briefly, just last thing, which is also, I think, refers to also things that Laura was talking about, which is the richness of what we get. We're looking at issues of action recognition, and for example, an action of drinking, just taking something and drinking from it. And it turns out that humans are very sensitive to very subtle properties of objects that agents are holding. They are very important, and people are paying attention to this. And they can, for example, in the case of drinking, they automatically and naturally, spontaneously, they test whether the object being held in the hand is open from above. It's sort of a container that can contain something. And even if it's a new object that you haven't seen before, but if it conforms to this description and this property, that will be okay for drinking. And it's interesting again that infants at very early age, it's very surprising, was very surprising to me, one of the first properties and relations they note about objects is whether or not an object can be a container. And it's not something that as a computer vision person you'd expect. And they know about containers, they recognize them, and they know a rich semantic information about them, that they can carry liquid and other objects inside them, all that already in the first few months of life. So I think that we see an interesting contrast here, that at least in an unsupervised setting, the kind of main systems of today, if you give them many, many images, they will extract mainly things which are statistically salient, not necessarily very meaningful, and will attach labels to them. And what you really want in more cognitive systems is to give the system many instances, many images, but you want somehow the system to learn from this the more meaningful things, even if they are not very salient, like gaze and containment and so on, and use them in order to construct a very rich semantic understanding of what's going on. So I think that will be an important thing that we'll have to understand and discover and be able to put into our system, that there are structures innate for us inside the system that bias us in certain ways, that the structures are already partly there, and they are ready to get out the important information from the sensory data. Now, how do you discover them? How do we get all of this structure that guide our learning? And I think that are more specialized than the very general purpose learning mechanism. There are two ways. I think one is the kind of thing that Laura and others and Liz and others are doing. I think that we can get them from studying humans and trying to understand what goes on in our cognitive systems. I think that it can also be studied in sort of more machine learning and formal ways. After all, even these innate mechanisms were learned in some sense by evolution and wired into our brains, but you can still think about it as a learning problem in which you get lots and lots of examples over a long time, and somehow you learn to develop this innate structure. So I think it's something that can be approached formally, but probably not exactly. It will be a somewhat different kind of learning in terms of what you get, how you start with, and what you end up with. I think it's doable, it's approachable, and it's something that should be tried, but it's not exactly the kind of learning which is currently being developed and being discussed in standard learning algorithm, and it will require some changes and some new conceptual approaches. So that's my take.
Okay, I've talked for several hours recently, and so I will be rather brief. I want to respond to Josh by saying I'm convinced deep networks are going to be able to learn physics. I agree with everything else he said, because he's right. And I want to respond to Shimon by saying the vision systems I was talking about are disembodied vision systems. They're just trying to be labeled for objects. But of course, the real vision system is embodied in the whole organism that has goals and pays attention to things. And I think a lot of what you want is going to come out of embodying the vision system in a larger system. it's learning to achieve its ends and so on, like using vision. And I think it's an open question as to whether you can learn that whole larger system by doing stochastic gradient descent. I think probably you can. I don't think you need much innate, but that's an open question. I agree with him that if these disembodied vision systems aren't going to get at things like that, you're going to need it within a whole system. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Great.
So there is this question that is the first one in this list. Well, and I think I think it's also related to the kind of West Coast, East Coast bias. I think Jeffrey is West Coast by now. The West Coast attitude is you can learn everything from experience. And the East Coast, maybe because of Chomsky, is you have to have some priors, some genes, information from evolution.
Yeah, I think there's a form of argument that I attribute to Chomsky, and it goes like this. Because I, Chomsky, can't figure out how you can learn language, it's innate.
Right?
There are more sophisticated forms of
nature versus nurture, right?
But mostly it's, when people say things are innate, it's because they can't see how they could possibly be learned.
That's partly true, but on the other hand,
And all you have to do is show them.
on the other hand, there is this old idea that I think you rediscovered. It's an idea that back from 1890. The name is
The Baldwin effect.
Yes.
And the Baldwin effect says even the innate stuff was learned first.
Well, but it says also that even the innate stuff needs learning, right?
Yep.
So one consequence of that, almost everything. If you have an organism that is sophisticated enough to have a general learning machinery, almost everything it can do is partly genes and partly learning from experience. You should explain the effect first.
Really?
Yes.
Without the white.
Sure.
How many people know what the Baldwin effect is? Okay, less than the Baldwin effect. B-A-L-D-W-I-N. Gosh. How many minutes do I have to explain it? You give me a number of minutes and I'll explain it in that many minutes.
4.
4, okay. I could do it in 2. So, there was a guy called Darwin and there was a guy called Lamarck. And Lamarck said, you inherit characteristics you acquire in your lifetime. And Darwin said, no, you don't. Is this the right level of discourse? And the question is, can you get learning to guide evolution? And the answer is yes. Oh, can I give you the 6-minute explanation?
Let's speak about connections and the neural network.
Okay, I'll give you a little analogy. Suppose I have a little neural net, and it has 20 connections in it, and they have to be set to the right values for the neural net to perform well. So suppose it's a circuit for mating, and if you set the 20 connections to the right values, they're on or off. If you set them to on or off, whatever the right value is, it will produce lots of offspring. And if you don't, it won't. And you'd like to get that into the DNA of the organism. So you'd like the organism to be born with 20 decisions in the DNA made right. Well, one way to do that is to have, we're going to have a very naive model where for each decision you have 2 alleles, and you have to get the right allele. For each organism to have a whole bunch of genes that start off random, and to do crossover, and to run a genetic algorithm. And it's only 1 in a million that's going to work, because you have to get 20 decisions right. So obviously you're going to have to build at least 1 million organisms, on average, before you get a hit, and before you get any benefit. And for that to invade the population is going to be hard, because if you now mate and you lose one of the alleles, you're not going to be fit anymore. So it's going to be millions you're going to have to build. But now suppose that each organism can do learning during its lifetime, and it has three versions of the allele. It has wire it into a yes, wire it into a no, or leave it to learning. And suppose you start off in the population with these more or less equally distributed for each allele, for each decision. Then each organism runs for 1,000 iterations. So now what's going to happen of learning? And an iteration of learning is much faster than an iteration of producing offspring. So now what's going to happen is the organisms that are born with the hardwired ones correct, but the remainder left to learning, during their lifetime have a good chance in these 1,000 iterations of setting the remainder correctly, and therefore having lots of offspring, and therefore they will be fitter. So you can get a fit organism by not making all the decisions, by making some of the decisions right and leaving the rest to learning. And so you get selective advantage for getting some of the decisions right. So now you turned a spike into a hump, and now you can evolve much faster. And if you build about 30,000 organisms and do crossovers between them, the whole population will have most of the alleles set right. So it's basically, you have to do 1 million, but you could divide 1 million into 1,000 organisms, each of which does 1,000 learning trials. And so for the 1,000 organisms, you try different combinations of the hardwired things, and the 1,000 learning trials, you try different combinations of the softwired things, and between them, you're going to get a good a hit eventually. And that's just a much more efficient way to get stuff into the DNA than pure evolution. And it's an example of a very general principle, which is, if ever you can get a fast loop to help you out with the slow loop, it's a good idea. So if you're doing motor control, can I go on for another minute? I know I've talked a lot. If I'm holding a piece of chalk, let's suppose this was a piece of chalk. The thing about dongles is, you can generalize dongles, but the dongles don't generalize. You need a different one for each apple. Anyway, so if I'm holding a piece of chalk and I try and write on a board, and I do it by open loop control, one of two things will happen. Either I will be a bit short of the board and nothing will happen. No, I didn't really want to. Oh, right. Either I'll be a bit short of the board and nothing will happen, or I'll be a bit the other side of the board and I'll smash the dongle or the board if I've got non-compliant control. But if I make my muscles have the right appropriate stiffnesses, then and I am just beyond the board, then the board will stop me. And if you ask, how fast in this process is the board stopping me? That's got a loop at the speed wave of shock waves in your arm. So it's an incredibly fast loop in the physics. And by putting a fast loop like that to help you with the problem, you can do much better than just having pure control. So you control the stiffness of muscles so that you got very, very fast feedback in the physics to make up for the fact you have slow feedback in the neurons. And that's true everywhere in biology. So you have developmental loops of a time period of like 20 minutes. And that makes evolution go much faster, because now evolution doesn't have to solve all the problems. It just has to set up something so that development will solve the problem. And then you have learning, which is much faster than development, and so on. So there's a very general principle in biology, which we always use something faster to help something slower. And the Baldwin principle is just an example of that, of using learning to help evolution.
Right. But this says that almost everything that a sophisticated organism like us can do, if it's important for evolution, is going to be partly learning. There will be no evolutionary pressure for the genes to solve completely the problem if there is a general purpose learning algorithm that...
If you have something where you have to get a big co-adaptation, it's going to be very hard to do purely evolutionary.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, a lot of these problems will be solved, at least in part or to a good extent, by genes. And the story may be just more than speed. I think Shimon may have something to say here. Is that? I'm just guessing.
Yeah, it's related to the speed, but if you, in machine learning in general, the problem is to find the best function to perform a particular task, minimizing the loss and so on, within a restricted family of possible functions, often called hypothesis space, right? So it's okay if you are in the hypothesis space, then you can use some examples and find the optimal solution. Now, where does the hypothesis space come for us? If it's in our brain, that's probably wired in by evolution. So evolution has the task of learning over many years what's a good hypothesis space, and then you're searching for the function within this hypothesis space. But then there is a nice picture of division of labor between evolution and individual learning, because now evolution doesn't have to search every possible solution. Is this good? Is this good? Is that good? It can chunk the search into big hypothesis spaces. This big circle, this big circle, this big circle. If it found the right circle, then the rest of the job will be done by the agent. And
I completely agree.
so it's a nice division of, which is not just about speed, but I think that the whole thing is. Now we are, as a community, we usually try to do, let's look for DPM with HOG and 8 orientation and 32 beams and so on. Does this work? And if it doesn't work, we start something else. So I think that eventually we will have to find ways of not just assuming that we have the right hypothesis space and then showing that our systems can, given this, and if everything works right, we can do it, but we will have to somehow automate research over the two sides of the coin, not just have algorithms that given hypothesis space can find the right solution within the restricted family, but to combine the search of this and that and have the whole thing working together. And I think that we do not have it yet.
I mean, basically, if you believe in stochastic gradient descent, then you ought to believe in it at the meta level too. But right now we're doing stochastic gradient descent in these relatively dumb nets, and it's working better than things did before, so we made a little step forward. But maybe the next step forward is going to come from changing the kind of nonlinearity we use in the net, or maybe it's going to come from changing the architecture of the net. I mean, each time we get a system that works better, we've made progress, but you shouldn't assume you keep going in the same direction. You have to go off in different directions. And I think new directions are going to be different kinds of architecture for the net. But we don't know what the new directions are. And we don't know how much is innate. I just have a sort of basic feeling that the first thing you should try is to do it without making an innate assumption. Because an innate assumption is really easy. Just say it's all innate. We're done.
Well, because this is where the constraint of trying to engineer models, right? Like, to the extent that at least around here, we're not just telling stories, but we are building actual working models. Even when we're studying stories, like Patrick, he's building actual models of story understanding. So that's not a free path.
Right. I mean, it seems to me that there's an interesting question about whether, in principle, these things can be learned. And either way, there's a problem about how, in fact, you develop a computational system that does physics, whether it's developed by evolution or learned. But as an empirical fact, it seems pretty clear that there's a lot of evidence that a lot of things really are innate. There are precocial animals. They're born, they gallop across the plains, or they fly, which means they know a lot about scenes, and they know a lot about physics, and they know a lot about other agents, and that is innate insofar as they're not learning it, right? They're born and they're doing it. So given that we have a lot of data saying that this is in fact how a lot of organisms behave, it's the kind of thing that makes me sort of think about, to what extent are these models showing us the kinds of things these models can do? To what extent should I be taking these models as telling me how to make predictions about how humans do these things, or how other organisms do these things, how the brain is doing these things? Because they could be different kinds of questions. There could be things that you could learn that nonetheless turn out in practice to be innate, and that might support other kinds of learning and other kinds of development.
Yeah, I agree. But I don't think there's anything we do that can't in principle be learned, because if you take evolution and learning together, we came from dust and we do it.
Right.
But why would you
Density
want, what's the
evolution is
advantage of starting there, I guess? So what's the advantage, even from machine learning, of starting there, right? So humans don't start there, right? We start with at least as far as you can tell by testing neonates or control root chicks or the other kinds of things that happen. Organisms don't start as a blank slate, right? They start with a lot of innate structure. And that appears to be an advantage as far as evolution is concerned, because that is how, in practice, organisms are. So what's the advantage from a machine learning perspective of posing the additional challenge of how you might learn everything, as opposed to starting with those things that really are plausibly innate?
Okay, so over the last 40 years, I've heard lots of people say, this has to be innate, that has to be innate, this has to be innate, like Chomsky.
That has to be, just is. Just is.
Yes, I've heard lots of people say just is or has to be, and normally the argument has been, but the underlying argument has been there's no way you could learn that. So there was a wonderful NOVA program about language. I watched it about 10 years ago, and all these Chomsky students, who are now senior linguists, all looked straight at the camera, and they all said, if there's one thing we know for sure about language, it's that it's not learned. Okay, it was like a religious cult. They knew that, no, I withdraw the like. They knew that it wasn't learned. And I think it was mainly because they couldn't see how to do it based on spurious things like Gold's theorem, where you had to learn it perfectly. And as soon as you produce pack learning or something like that, all of that goes away. And it's now obvious that you can learn an awful lot of language. It doesn't answer the debate about how much is innate, but it doesn't look like there needs to be much innate. You can learn grammar, for example. It's not a big problem. Another example I like is when I studied before you were born, they told me orientation detectors, the fact that neurons detected oriented lines, that was innate. And people were pretty confident about that. And then after a while, people learned to extract oriented things. And then later on, they said, well, look, if you look in the cortex of a monkey, you'll find these topographic maps, and you'll find, for example, patches that have high cytochrome oxidase, and these patches have color opponent cells, as opposed to sort of what I call black and white cells. They're lower frequency, and they come in patches, and they're typically red, green versus yellow, blue. And that's obviously innate. I had people tell me that was obviously innate. It turns out, if you take a simple learning algorithm with a simple architecture with locality in it, and you just apply it to patches from the visual world, you get a map that looks just like a monkey. You get these continuously changing high spatial frequency orientation detectors. You get these color blobs, and the color blobs are low frequency, and they're red, green opponent or yellow, blue opponent. And all of that is just there in the statistics of the world. The combination of the three things, the statistics of the world, a sensible gradient descent learning algorithm, and some architectural restrictions, which I agree are innate, but it was locality. There's a locality of connections. And you end up with color blobs. And you would have sworn that color blobs were innate. I mean, most neuroscientists would have told, well, Bob was there. But most neuroscientists would have said the color blobs were innate. They weren't something you developed in response to the structure of the world.
And neuroscience, every time there's been a debate like this, the answer is always in between. There's always some innate aspects that come with the biology, and then it always gets refined with experience. But I mean, so I guess I really don't understand what this argument is about. No one wants to argue that there are parts of behavior that are not deterministic in some way, right? So if you allow for supervised learning, you could presumably create a system to emulate anything that humans have evolved to do. So given that, then what is this discussion about? As you're saying, is what things need supervised learning and what things are all unsupervised, that are just basically responding to natural statistics in the world?
I think as a matter of fact, if we want to understand human intelligence, we don't know what intelligence in general is. There is very practical definition about human intelligence, basically the Turing test.
Yeah, but you want your machine to emulate the human, but why do you care how the human got to be that way?
Well,
that's the human is the ground truth, so you want your system to emulate it.
One implication is that why should we explore everything that can be possibly learned? It's like saying I start from quantum chromodynamics and I want to predict evolution and biology. It's crazy. You have to start from what human intelligence is and what is determined a priori by the genes and what is learned from visual experience. So I think, Jeffrey has always been for finding a machinery that can learn everything and forget about evolution and the genes. And I find that is crazy. I put you on the spot.
No, my principle has always been you should first see if there's any way it could be learned before you say it must be innate.
Okay, agree.
I think that's a good principle.
Yeah,
I think it's actually, I think, really interesting to look at the recent history of deep learning, right? So you were saying, okay, well, who knows where the next, or you were making some speculation about where the next step is going to come. Maybe it's from a new kind of architecture or something like that, right? I mean, the things like that you talked about as what are the key steps that make the deep learning system work? A certain kind of layered architecture, for better or worse. The convolutional architecture is a good one, but maybe the max pooling one is good for some things, but not for others, right? Like those are innovations that were made by very smart people, maybe taking various kind of semi-random steps and trying things out and seeing what happened. But I think it's interesting to look at that process of discovery that led the field of machine learning and neural nets to come up with these really cool architectures. In a lot of ways, it looks a lot like evolution, right? A lot of parallel search of trying things out and seeing what works. Often, it's not the theory that drove those most useful discoveries, but just trying some things out. And because these are human beings, they have a little bit of intuition that guides them. Maybe it's more Lamarckian or Baldwinian there or something. But so in some sense, it seems like it's almost like a parallel route that a kind of cultural evolution, basically, that I think when you look in the brain, if there is a brain correspondence of these systems, the analogous choices, like how many layers there are, or where the modules are, or whether there's convolution, those, I think almost everybody believes those are genetic, not learned.
I completely believe that.
So it does seem, it's interesting, right? It seems like the things that were most important for getting deep learning to work, I mean, in addition to, yes, some things we're learning, are actually basically these evolutionary steps. And
yes, because once you've got stochastic gradient descent and it's running, then what you have to do is figure out what system you need to run it in so that it works, and that's what evolution was doing.
Right, but
what I object to is what I'm very suspicious of is when someone tells me we have to be born knowing about hands. Now I don't know the data you're talking about, so
that was actually one of the points was exactly that you do not need that. It was more like a Baldwin effect because we did not. The point was that you do not have to be born with hand detectors, but if you're just sensitive, in this case, for example, you have some learning system that is much more primitive than that, but it knows something about regions in the image moving other regions and so on. And you lift the rest to the.
Then it will pick up on hands.
Then you get hands, and then you divide the labor in the right way between what the evolution teaching and individual learning, and it shows the power of getting just the right thing without worrying about programming by evolution the final solution to every imaginary problem that the agent will face.
I guess I'm as confused as Bob, because it seems to me that it's very expensive to wire anything in, so therefore the most useful thing to wire in is the capacity to learn rapidly. So the trade-off must have something to do with the computational trade-off of how expensive is it to code it versus how efficient is it to learn it. So I think that if we didn't have computationally elegant ways of learning what a hand looks like, the kind of stuff that Shimon is studying now, then it would have gradually been evolved in, because it's a useful thing.
I think there's some things that you can't afford to learn, like maybe falling off cliffs and maybe picking up poisonous snakes and things. And there's very good reason why you just can't afford to have one trial and you're dead, and that's not good for learning.
Yeah.
And so I'm quite happy to believe there may be fairly low-level systems wired in that give you primitive responses to those things to avoid them. It seems hard to say you should leave that to learning because you don't want to fall off the cliff.
Well, I amend it. Things that can be efficiently learned without killing yourself.
Yes, okay.
Also is bringing up the question of what intelligence actually is, and that takes us all the way back to Turing and the Turing test, which I always thought was a bad idea. I thought the Turing test, I've read Turing's paper maybe 20 times because I assign it every year. And
you don't have to do the assignments yourself.
Facing MIT students has a wonderfully focusing effect on the mind. Anyway, every time I read it, I become more and more convinced that Turing wasn't actually serious about the Turing test. He really wanted to talk about why all the arguments against computers being intelligent were refutable. And he was a mathematician, so he really just wanted to get around the usual critique of, well, how can you talk about it without defining it? So the Turing test was a circumnavigation that I think led to several decades of unfortunate distraction because in the end, that particular kind of Turing test, which mostly involved reasoning, was not, in my view, anything more than the shadows dancing on the wall. The real defining characteristic, in my view, of human intelligence is the ability to understand stories, and reasoning is just a special case. It's recipe following. So I think if Turing had taken Marvin Minsky's course, he wouldn't have even bothered because I think Marvin has this notion of a suitcase word, which is a very healthy way, in my view, of thinking about intelligence. Intelligence, like many words, are creativity, emotion, all of those kinds of words are what Marvin calls suitcase words because they're really words that cover all kinds of capabilities. And so when you try to define them or think about what they are, it's better to just say they are many kinds of things. Let's talk about the particular kind you're thinking of. So if you ask questions like, is Watson intelligent? Then right now you can say, of course it is. It's intelligent. It plays Jeopardy. It has a certain kind of intelligence which allows it to do that. But that's only one kind of intelligence. There are many others. So I think what we're all talking about is different aspects of that complex bundle of capabilities that we tend to give this universal label to.
Do you think consciousness is a suitcase concept?
Yeah, to a large extent. And I think that, to me, I have a very simple notion of what consciousness is. It's reciting the story of what's going on around you. It's a kind of well, I feel like when I'm being conscious, I'm telling the story of what's going on. I'm telling the story about how I'm involved in a panel. Josh is sitting next to me. Laura's sitting next to him. There's an audience. I'm saying something. That's the kind of running story that I'm telling to myself as I.
Why are you doing it? That is why are you doing that? If that's what it is. What's the purpose?
What's the purpose? Another dimension of the suitcase word, I suppose. Yes.
Yes. I've thought a good deal about consciousness, and it has very much to do with rehearsal and planning. Going over past events and planning future action. Consciousness is a delayed process, so it can't control things in real time effectively at all, but it's very good for learning from past experience and planning future action.
Yeah, so you're deciding what's going on now so you can repeat it in the future.
Or learn from it.
Yeah.
So before we finish, I'm curious to know how the panel thinks about, a couple of questions there. One is the importance of neuroscience for eventually understanding intelligent and making intelligent machines. I would like to know what Jeff thinks, but also what everybody else thinks. And the other one is about the role of theory. right now, deep learning networks are difficult to understand from a theoretical point of view. Is that satisfactory or not? You end up actually recording from deep learning networks to understand what the units are doing, which is kind of ironic. We have a model of the brain which does well, but we don't understand why it works as well as it does. Is that what the goal is?
Well, is there any a priori reason why you should expect to be able to understand it?
No, I mean, biology is the way it is. There is a lot of, in principle, that may be the situation. Evolution has made a lot of random decisions, like history. Does not make much sense to try to understand the sequence of that. But, people have different opinions. Who wants to start, neuroscience, theory? You can choose.
Well, I'll say something about neurons. And again, as a cognitive scientist, I'm not sure if by neuroscience you include cognitive science in that or not.
No,
but
I was thinking more about the wet part.
Yeah. So to me, I mean, again, I come more from the cognitive side. I'm ultimately interested. I don't think we're going to be satisfied. I'm not going to be satisfied until I understand how it works in the brain, because it's just the question of, as Alan Newell put it, how can the mind exist in a physical universe and a physical object in the physical universe? It's just as great a question as anything on the software or cognitive level. But I think where there's real inspiration for me, and here I'm also inspired by some of Jeff's ideas under what's called the Helmholtz machine. It's sort of both by some of the kind of work that Tommy and neuroscientists working with you have done, building models of actual brains and strength there, and some of Jeff's ideas. To say, to me, when I talk about analysis by synthesis or inverse graphics or rich or hard problems of scene understanding, the biggest challenge is, how do you get these two things? How do you get such a rich percept of the world so quickly, right? We can build these inverse graphic systems, which, if you're sort of willing to wait long enough, they can perceive incredibly rich structure in the world. It's to take it to some extreme. If you go to the people at Pixar and you say, snap a picture like the picture you're taking right here, and go to someone in Pixar and say, okay, we want you guys to build a 3D model that when you inside your computer graphic system, light it and render it, will look just like this thing that we see here, only it'll be an actual 3D physical model, so you can move the people around and move the things around and imagine what would happen and solve the tetrahedron problems and all that. They could do that. It'll just take a lot of person power and computer power to do that. And somehow it seems to me that the brain is able to do that inverting of graphics, just in a few hundred milliseconds. And when you look at the hardware, I mean, I think this is where, though I don't know how a graphics engine or the inversion machinery is actually implemented in neural circuits, you get a lot of constraints that you don't get from psychology by looking to see, okay, well, here's what these neurons can do at this stage of the processing after 10 milliseconds, after 50 milliseconds, after 100 milliseconds, right? I mean, we have, some of Molly's classic work and even some of the most recent developments in it showing how much people can get of high-level scene understanding in just a relatively few milliseconds. But as far as understanding the machinery that can solve that problem so quickly, that's where I think neuroscience gives us information. And then for people who don't know Jeff's Helmholtz machine idea, the idea that you can take a rich generative model, like your graphics model, and learn a kind of bottom-up, very fast, approximate inversion of that, a kind of what he called a recognition model, that might look a lot like a feed-forward pathway in the ventral stream in the visual system. I think there's something very deep and interesting there to be understood about the combination of learning recognition models to invert something like a graphics engine and taking constraint from the actual multi-level architecture we see in the brain.
Can I try number one? The answer, I think, is not always. If you think that Deep Blue is intelligent in the sense that it beats everybody else in chess, then we got there without understanding how people play chess. But on the other hand, I think if we do understand human intelligence and human brain, my intuition is that surely will enable us to take many kinds of machine intelligence to another level.
Yeah, what I meant with intelligence was really the kind of intelligence that we need to answer not one of these questions about legal skills, but all of them, as a person of good.
Then I think you're getting into intuitional ground, and many times intuition is formed by failure to do it any other way, and so my intuition is that that's the right way.
Well, yeah, arguing from other analogies, say if you have theories of color vision, it's hard to imagine that your abstract theory of color vision could be useful without taking into account the properties of the rods and cones. I mean, you must understand something about the biology, or you don't understand why the organism works the way it does. Likewise for hearing. There's just so many things that you need to understand.
That's the same argument I was using before. In principle, you can go from biology to quantum chromodynamics, reduction. You cannot go the opposite way because there are too many possibilities. Right?
Too many ways to learn.
Just a historical note, Mar was mentioned several times here. There was a nice paper by Mar, which is less known. It was called AI, A Personal View, in which he talks about theories and he divides them into theory type 1 and theory type 2. Type 1 is Schrödinger equation. You have some nice, concise formulation from which you can derive everything. And he thought, I'm not sure what was the example of type 2. It's
protein folding.
Protein folding, but even the explanation is, what can we do? It's very difficult, very involved, many interacting things, and there's no way to reduce it further. And he says that he was not sure what's the right theory of intelligence, and he says, I'm just hoping that it will be close to type 1. That's a hope. Maybe, theory is required. I don't know. Maybe sort of type 2-ish, which would not be very simple and concise.
So, Jack, what do you think? Theory or not?
Let me answer the other question about the brain.
Okay.
My hope has always been that we want to build a bridge between neuroscience and AI. At least I do. I want to figure out how a bunch of neurons can be intelligent. And you can work from the neurons, or you can work from how do you make things that are smart. And the hope is that the task will give you quite a few constraints, and just the problem of learning to do things will give you some constraints, and that you'll be able to build this bridge from both ends. Neuroscientists will be building from one end, people like me will be building from the other end, where neuroscientists are constrained to make it faithful to the empirical data. There's no use having neuroscience theory that posits that every neuron has two axons that send different signals. It'd be very convenient if they did, but neurons don't seem to be like that. Although I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years' time they say they are.
They may learn to do that.
But from the sort of AI end, you want to make things that work. And now the hope is, when you get these two things close enough, you'll notice that to make it work better, you need to make it more like the other thing. It'll be like magnets that get close enough. And once they get close enough, they go clonk. That's the hope. And so this idea of capsules is saying, look, our neural net models are very unlike the brain in that they don't have this layered architecture of cortex where lots going on in a mini column and there's a small output compared with what's going on. But maybe if we push them in that direction, they'll work better. And so my constraint is only go in directions with your neural model that makes it work better. And if that makes it more like the brain, that's really nice. But if it makes it less like the brain, we'll try that too. But the hope is that eventually we'll get it so that it's obvious you need to make these go in the direction of each other, and you'll get a better neuroscience and you'll get things that work better. In the end, we all believe that if you really understood what was going on in the brain, you could make devices that work really well.
I'm glad Shmuel brought up the Mar paper on AI, a personal view. I've read that 20 times too, same reason. But what Mar said in the end was he expected that some parts of the theory will be type 1 and some parts will be type 2. Some parts will have elegant, simple, theoretically elegant solutions. Other parts may be complex messes which are their own best explanation. I'm hoping for more of the type 1. I'm sure there's type 2. But if we're all type 2, if we're all explained by a simple backprop net, I think I'd go sell insurance or something else instead.
You wrote that as type 2, not type 1?
Type 2 is the kind where you don't really understand it. It just works.
No, but the point about a simple backprop net is some very simple equations that govern everything. So simple backprop net is just like explaining turbulence with the Navier-Stokes equations. The Navier-Stokes equations are really simple equations. And at one level, you really understand turbulence because you run this simulation and it looks just like turbulence.
Well, yeah, Jeff, but then you change the weights, the way the weights are randomized, it works 1% better, and then you change them a little differently, and they work another 1% better, and your papers are full of stuff like that.
But the basic principle that you get the...
When you're saying if it ultimately lets be backprop, do you mean if it ultimately lets be backprop in the actual brain?
Well,
I mean backprop in the machine with enough data and enough
what I'm saying is
you can get something
that I hope it turns out like
those are two different
Jeff Day 2, not Jeff Day 1. Jeff Day 2 is all about structure and how structure constraint has to be there in order to constrain the learning to make it all work. And that I find elegant. But plain old backprop never struck me as particularly informing in the sense that it helps me to understand something. Yes, I understand how backprop works.
It's in your textbook.
And that is elegant, but
what about the analogy from biology? I think a lot of biology is not type 1, but there is one idea which is very elegant, which is the double helix. So that's type 1. Explains by itself a lot of things, and I hope
maybe that combined with natural selection and a few other principles of selection.
So
in some sense,
it's not the only thing,
right? But in some sense, that is the only algorithm we know for a fact builds an intelligent system, right? That the physical substrate of double helix and the whole biological machinery that builds cells and multicellular organisms, and
the way it replicates.
The way it replicates, and it builds a machine that builds itself, and it builds a learning machine, and I think the modern view of evolution is that it is an algorithmic process, right? It's a random one. It's not completely repeatable or predictable or always optimizing, but that really is an algorithmic process that builds intelligence. And if I hear maybe echoing something Shimon said, and I know some things you've talked about too, Tommy, and your stuff on the Baldwin effect. I think ultimately, if we had a theory of adaptive systems or a theory of building intelligence that involved both a theory of how evolution works and learning how they work together and their interactions and the different multi-scale things that go on. Just like there's, in humans, there's learning to learn and there's kind of evolving to evolve. Evolution builds new machinery that can evolve better. Right. I think ultimately, if we had an understanding of that, now that would be a very satisfying theory. And even if all the type 1 stuff was kind of offloaded into the way evolution works and some learning algorithms, and we couldn't actually understand the actual circuitry of the brain in action on a millisecond level, then that would still be pretty satisfying.
I think we all agree about this.
You left out development. I think it's very important that you have evolution in the game, and then you have development, which is a much faster loop, and then you have learning, which is even faster.
That's what I meant by the machine that builds itself.
So since we all agree, I think it's time to, it goes fast.